the basic question, I think, would be, is, in your opinion, is NATO heading towards a major escalation with Russia?
Well, we have to separate politics from reality. I think the thematic of the necessity for for viewing Russia as a threat worthy of escalation is a reality in Europe today. I mean, this is being used to justify military modernization, political realignments, industrialization efforts, basically a top to bottom rebuilding of Europe is being done on the foundation of the notion that Russia is a threat worthy of this kind of political, economic, societal investment. Then there's the reality. That NATO as a military institution is atrophied to the point that no amount of steroids and gym work will ever make this body recover, especially on a timeline, that would be conducive to, confronting Russia as it relates to the Ukrainian conflict. By the time Europe could get its act together, and I believe Europe is going to collapse long before it ever joins together. But a timeline. The Germans have spoken of 2029 as a potential date. This conflict will be long over. Russia will have achieved its objectives, and will have moved past this the current predicament that Europe has inflicted on itself.
John, your take on that?
Well, in the first place, we agree the escalation of NATO war making against Russia has been going on for a long time. That's not new. The escalation that is new is, you can see it in Poland, you can see it in France, you can see it in England, and it's in each country there are different circumstances. President Macron can attack a Russian oil cargo in a tanker offshore, called piracy by President Putin, because he's attempting now internally, as a weak president facing a hostile parliament, to rule by executive decree. So it helps in France to stimulate anti-Russian, anti-Slav race war making in order to facilitate the constitutional requirements that France faces a war threat. This is a French political problem in a weak NATO state, but the NATO alliance is composed of states like that. Whether we look at France, whether we look at the UK, whether we look at Germany, Poland, Norway, and the others. So the escalation is underway. The problem is that it's stimulated by the United States. It's part of the Trump plan to sequence wars along all of the NATO fronts. Now, we've, in the last 48 hours, seen a significant contradiction between, on the one hand, the foreign ministry of Russia, Sergei Ryabkov and Mikhail Galuzin, saying that the understanding reached between President Trump and President Putin at Anchorage has been exhausted, was Ryabkov's term. Emasculated was Galuzin's term. And both of them have added that this is primarily because of the European states' commitment to continuing the war on the Ukrainian battlefield and escalating the war along Russia's western and northern fronts. On the other hand, Yuri Ushakov, speaking for President Putin, and Putin himself in the last few hours in Dushanbe in a press conference, have insisted that this is not, the words aren't exhausted and emasculated. The words are that the understandings continued, so that the attempt on the part of the Kremlin to divide the escalation of NATO against Russia from the US and find some way of blocking NATO using Trump is in perilous condition right now, an uncertain condition.
Scott, let me start with a little bit critical question, which is the case of Russia and how the administration is in Russia, the Putin administration is united. In your opinion, when you look at Russia today, are there factional differences in Moscow on key strategic war, trade, and alliance issues?
In Moscow, the city, the physical entity
No,
of
I'm
the
talking
city,
about Moscow. I'm talking about Russia, the policy of Russia as a whole.
in terms of policy makers, key decision
Yeah,
makers.
exactly.
Look, I think Vladimir Putin runs a strong-handed but collegial government. I think there are forums and occasions where people can raise questions and concerns. They do this out of the limelight. I don't think Vladimir Putin tolerates, once a decision has been made, to tolerate, efforts by senior officials to publicly speak out against that. So a perception can be created that there is no opposition. I would say that my feeling is that there is a time and place for people to speak out, and that is encouraged. But once a decision has been made, the duty is to fulfill the objectives. So yeah, within Moscow, I think in the official circles, there are places where people can raise their objections. Once a decision has been made, then what happens is that people who are on the periphery of decision making, or people who were formerly associated with decision making but no longer, there you get you can get some critical voices heard. But they don't have Vladimir Putin's not losing any sleep at night over any of the critical voices that are being raised in Moscow today, in my opinion, because he is the commander in chief. He is the chief executive, and he has a process in which policies are formulated and implemented, and the government adheres to those processes. That's my take.
Yeah, John.
I agree that there are factions. You'd have to say, and I think Scott would agree, that in many respects, Russian decision-making, both on war, tactically, operationally, and strategically, on economic policy, Russia is a more democratic decision-making polity than France or the UK or the US, for that matter. When you look at the difference between the presidency and the Congress, factionalism can be pejorative, but in fact it's democratic. And what we have to understand about the way, there are two things about the way we understand Russian policymaking and Putin policymaking. The first is that it is collegial, as Scott said, and that means that people disagree on a whole range of important issues, and that in a collegial atmosphere, a collective atmosphere, collective decision-making is the plan, is the policy that Putin has adopted. Before Russia sent its first delegation, led by a presidential emissary, Vladimir Medinsky, to the Istanbul talks, the President Putin called in a very large meeting of the key officials. It was an attempt to show, and in fact to listen, and in fact implement collective decision-making. Now, last week, President Putin made a number of remarks at Valdai, a club conference in Sochi, which have been misinterpreted, and he has tried to back away and clarify what he said, including the key point that he made shortly afterwards, that he would rely on his colleagues to make decisions regarding, for example, the threatened deployment of Tomahawks against Russia, and so on. Since then, there was an early meeting of the Security Council, civilian body, and then an unusual meeting of commanders of the front armies, the general staff, and the defense minister. Now, that's collegiality operating. And the second major distinction in the Russian case, in President Putin's case, but not long before him, leaving out the Yeltsin period, Russia learns from its mistakes much faster than most people and most armies. And to admit that and acknowledge that mistakes have been made, mistakes of timing, mistakes of operation, mistakes of application, mistakes of anticipation, all of those things are admitted. That's how government should work, and that's how Russia does work. The mistakes that have been made and are being made, which we can come back to in a short while, involve, in particular, how to bring the war to a conclusion that achieves Russia's objectives, secures Russia in an indivisible security arrangement, not only with its next door neighbor, but with the entire neighborhood, with Europe. There's no doubt that people have strong differences. There's no doubt that when President Putin offered President Trump last February to suspend the electric war campaign against the Ukraine, the general staff were not happy. Not happy. In the last few weeks, we've seen let's say, a correction of what that factional difference amounted to. And the electric war campaign is now in full swing, maintained each day. So this isn't to say that people are opposed to the president. It's to say that they recognize mistakes of timing, of anticipation, of operations are made, and they're being corrected. And Putin has, to his credit and to the credit of the general staff, the intelligence services, and the foreign ministry, corrected and collectively what they want to do. But that leaves significant issues undecided, unresolved. One of them's Palestine and Israel.
Scott, do you feel that Donald Trump is ready or is willing to put an end to the conflict in Ukraine?
Donald Trump, you want me to, again, this is, I don't mean to be critical, but Nima, but reading Donald Trump's like reading tea leaves 5 months after the teacup's been emptied. It's let me comment on this. First of all, again, John and I are in total agreement the way that I perceive the Russian government to function. I would say that, however, we have to acknowledge that with the Trump administration, we have a beast that's totally different than the way the Russian government was designed to operate. Back when, I was doing arms control and such, we had a State Department, we had a Department of Defense, we had various official agencies that interfaced professionally with their Soviet counterparts. And for the most part, this kind of professional relationships existed, across different administrations. This war began in its current manifestation in February 2022 under the Biden administration. And the problem with the Biden administration is they cut off relations with Russia. All of these professional contacts that would happen, where Undersecretary of, Deputy Defense, whatever, has a phone book. Back in the day, we call a Rolodex, and you could call your counterpart, and it was encouraged. You could talk and say, "Hey, problem X, Y, and Z. I've got to go, work this thing out. Help me out here. What's going on? What do we need to do to keep this from spinning out of control?" And there was this kind of dialogue that was done at the lower levels to keep problems from manifesting themselves into things that the big bosses had to deal with. Biden cut that off. There just was no talking at all. And this caused the Russians to go into a specific kind of decision-making mode. Basically, you're working in a vacuum where assumptions have to be made, et cetera. And unfortunately, when you're geared to receiving information inputs and you suddenly don't have that, you have to make decisions in an information vacuum, and mistakes are made, as John said. But the thing about the Russians is they learn from their mistakes immediately because they own up to them, and then they make corrective action, and they move forward. So Trump comes in, and Anatoly Antonov, the former Russian ambassador to the United States, when I asked him, who do you want to win? He said, "I ain't touching that question with a 10-foot pole." But I will tell you this: the Russians prefer predictability. we would like predictability. We'll take that over just about anything, because even if it's bad, we can make effective policy based upon predictability, based upon known knowns. Donald Trump is anything, he's not predictable. And the one thing that happened is that he didn't staff the various agencies that Biden had shut down. So from the Russian perspective, you still have zero input coming in. But the big change was that the top levels were talking. And see, this is problematic, because when top levels are talking, but you don't have backup from the intermediate and the lower levels, everything else is still dependent upon what's happening at the top. And you're not getting the normal advisory chain going up before a primary talks to a primary, a principal to a principal. It's happening in a vacuum or a very limited advisory capacity. And I think what we're seeing today in Russia is that Vladimir Putin has the task of dealing with Donald Trump in a advisory support vacuum, that there are many people who would normally be involved before presidents talk to presidents. There's so many other people that are talking, making sure that agendas are defined, et cetera. And this isn't happening. Now, this is being concentrated in a handful of people around President Putin's office. And so there's a disconnect between what Putin is trying to do with Trump, manage an unmanageable personality to the benefit of Russian policy, trying to get Trump to move along in the direction that Russia wants, understanding that Trump is being pulled in 50 different ways. And this creates a complexity, a level of complexity that I think we have to factor in when we are being critical of the Russian government. We have to acknowledge that Donald Trump is a problem set unlike any other problem set the Russians have ever dealt with. And there's no bureaucratic answer to Donald Trump. It's a problem of the Russian presidency. And oftentimes that means that the presidency is disconnected from the collegial advisors that they have. And he ends up having to back brief them, as opposed to them briefing him up front. He ends up back briefing them on things. So I just, that's my perspective on the issue. And I'll be more than happy to yield the floor right now to see if John has critical commentary on this, which is okay.